Welcome to Tom Talks, our first one of the season. We are here with our research ecologist, Tom Simpson, and I'm Jackie Bureau, the stewardship ecologist for McHenry County Conservation District. So we are going to get started. Go ahead, Tom.
Good morning. Nice wintry morning outside. I hope you're all warm and cozy inside. Yeah, this is our first Tom Talk of the year. I've taught a number of workshops over the last 30 years on plant families. It seems to be one of those things that plant-oriented people grasp on. Often you just learn the names of things, first the common names, and maybe you learn some Latin names, but you don't really understand the background of plant classification. So that's really what I wanted to try to do today is to really talk about plant families, but in the broader context of understanding relationships between species and between genera, those groupings of species like oaks or sunflowers, and how in plant classification we try to understand all those relationships. For I've done a number of Tom Talks on plant related things. In fact, there are more than this. These seem to be the most obvious ones. The first three are really plant ID things, which do mention genera and families of plants, of native and some exotic plants of our area. And the basic botany one is one that really gets into how plants work and how they're put together. And we'll talk some about that today. There's always a danger in botany or really any science is full of terminology, and botany is no different. Uh, I'm going to try to be careful with that, but inevitably I'm going to say some words without stopping to define them and ask a question. I mean, I'll probably stop. I've got a few slides in here that ask for questions, so I'll stop every 15 or 20 minutes. But if you want to ask a question, just wait for a pause and and unmute yourself and ask the question, or you just send a note to Jackie and she can ask the question. So in general, if one person has a question, 80% of the class has the same question but won't ask it. So by all means, ask a question if I say something that seems a bit too technical or just seems off to you or you don't understand it. Um, Lots of printed things. These are just some things from Amazon. I mean, all these books are good. I've looked through, I've used them in the past, and the only qualification I would tell you is that the higher level classification is undergoing a lot of changes today due to molecular biology, and it's now become a really important tool in plant ecology, and it wasn't 30 years ago. And so there's a lot of revision of genera and family groupings as a result of that. So while I can look at these books and get a lot of really good stuff out of them, some of the families when you go back and forth between that and a book like The Flora of the Chicago Region that's more up to date, you'll find some disagreement about what is a family. But in the end, you'll learn a lot from these books or from more recent floras also. Um, Today I'm gonna have a couple of young people help me with a presentation today. I sometimes get lonely doing these talks. I'm sort of talking to the computer. So we have a couple of young people to help us today named Bud and Emma. Um,
Tom, I think we're not hearing the sound. We may need to click that include sound button again.
Here we go again. Hold on. So I need to go back to the share, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So stop sharing.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. Did you find it?
So hold on.
Hi, Emma.
There we go. Perfect. That's working. Go ahead. Hi, Bud. You seem to be puzzling over something. What is it?
I heard this Tom guy was going to talk about plants today, like where those fancy sounding names come from and how people classify plants of different types. I thought about it a little and realized there are a lot of different kinds of plants in the world. And I wondered how I would organize them all. Like, how about big plants and small plants? Or plants with small leaves versus big leaves? Or plants of wet places and dry places? I could keep adding groups until I had organized all the plants in the world, and everything in a class would look and behave kind of like everything else in that class. Or I could put them into groups based on how I might use them, like plants I could use to build a house, or plants I could eat, maybe plants that look pretty. This seems pretty useful, but it's not very satisfying.
Maybe that's because you put them in groups for your own purposes, but the names don't really say anything about why the plants look the way they look or do the things they do.
You're right. Plants must come from somewhere.
Well, there are two ways people have tried to do that. I mean, to classify plants to reveal why they are the way they are.
And if we could understand where they come from, we might see why there are groups like daisies and oaks, but there are no daisy oaks or oak daisies. But how would I do that?
They're called natural classifications. The first was created by Carl Linnaeus, the great Swedish naturalist, whose classification system tried to recognize the divine plan of creation.
So, the divine order was a natural classification?
Well, it certainly was for Linnaeus. He created a hierarchical classification, meaning each species fits in a small group, and small groups fit within larger groups. We still use a very similar system today: species, genus, family, order, class, and kingdom. He also developed the naming convention we still use today. Every species has a two-part name. The first name refers to the genus to which the species belongs. For white oaks, for example, that would be Quercus, the genus for all oaks. And the second name refers to the particular species of oak. In the case of white oak, the species name is alba, Latin for white. So the two-part name, aka the Latin binomial, for white oak is Quercus alba.
So that's where those funny names come from. But if Linnaeus thought he was describing God's plan for creation, what is the second type of natural classification?
Well, the other came from Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution of species by natural selection changed the way we thought about where species come from and the relationships between species. Darwin used the hierarchical naming system of Linnaeus, but he provided a mechanism, evolution by natural selection, which explained why two species in the same genus or family will resemble each other more than two species from different genera or families. And it's because they're more closely related genetically, like two members of the same family.
I like that. Well, I think we should let Tom get on with his presentation now. Who knows? We might learn something.
You never know. You might learn something today. That's dangerous. Thank you, Bud. Thank you, Emma. Uh, why learn about plant families? I mean, I think the obvious thing has to do with plant identification. I think all of us, in our initial attraction to plants, want to know their names. I know that was the case for me back. That would have been the early 1980s. Feel a great sense of accomplishment in going out into a weed field and finding out that this one is, uh, you know, uh, one weed and another one is a different. But the idea of putting a name on it was very powerful. It felt really good to do that. And the more you learn about plants, the more plants there are, the more that list of things that you know gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Sorting through all the possibilities gets harder. Um, and each step you take in a process, let's say a botanical key, if anyone has ever been through a technical key or any simple key where it asks you a question, you give an answer, and then it directs you to the next question. You give it an answer. It directs you to the next question. You give it an answer. Every one of those, every one of those questions and answers is an opportunity for a mistake. And with 2,000 plants in the Chicago region, you might have to go through a lot of steps to get there. As there's only 200 or 1/10 as many species in the aster family, a fourth of that in the legume family, and only eight species in the genus Silphium. So if I can recognize these groups, then taking it that next level becomes a much simpler task. I go right to a book on silphiums or the key to silphium or the key to asters, and I don't have to go through the first 10 steps in the key to get my answer. So if on a plant key, ideally you would divide the group in half with each step in a key, and you could see to go from roughly 2,000 plants in the Chicago area down to one, it takes you about 11 steps, and that's 11 chances to make an error. And if you've ever been through a plant key, it gets really tedious because you make one wrong turn and then you don't know where you are. You have to go back and try again. So if I can start somewhere down here at step 6 or 7, then it greatly facilitates my ability to find an answer. So that learning of families and learning of genera is really handy in Plant ID. And one of the things I want to talk about today is even though probably most of you and for me when I was learning plants, it was that name for the species that was the golden goal of working with plants. I wanted to know what they were. Eventually naming isn't completely satisfying, that you just name more and more things. But what's learning about classification tells you about the relationships between species and between genera, that those larger relationships then become more and more interesting. And it starts to tell you about plant evolution. And then you can go from there to understanding the depth of history in the origin of the diversity of plants we have today. So in taking it, learning plant families and plant genera is handy for identification, but it also gives you a deeper understanding of the plants themselves. We live in a world with lots of different things, and we're all classifiers. We're all putting things into categories as a part of understanding them. And science, natural science, gives us some very powerful tools for separating mammals from birds, from insects, from rocks, from water to plants. And that's not a new thing because people 16 or 17,000 years ago were living in the same complicated, complex world, and they had to organize it. They had to organize it into categories, um, understand their relationship between the categories and their relationship to each one of the categories, and then try to explain it. And this painting is, I think this comes from Lascaux in France. This is an attempt of people to explain those relationships. It's an old taxonomy, one that we can't completely understand anymore, but it's that same need of people to understand types of things in their relationships. Um, Coming much closer to the present in medieval times, when we looked at the creation, we divided it into levels of nearness to God. So down here at the bottom is mineral matter. The next step up is plants, then animals, then people, then angels, and God. And so that was an attempt to understand relationships between these categories of things, and that's meaningful to the person who is doing the understanding. Uh, with Darwin's work in the middle of the 19th century, uh, we really, I think, probably one of the most shocking and revolutionary re-understandings of the world in the history of science myself. But he looked at the living world and saw it not as a created thing, but as something that had developed over for him an almost infinitely long period of time by the accumulation of tiny increments of change, one species dividing into two, and those two into 4 or 6 species. And that's what this drawing is depicted. I'll just read this last. This is the last sentence of The Origin of Species, at least the first edition. There is grandeur in this view of life, that is the evolutionary view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms, or only into one, and that whilst the planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity. He was living in Newton's universe at the time. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So just in that one sentence, he really captures the essence of this, going from a few and perhaps only one simple beginning to the total diversity of life on the earth today. Um, Evolution, in Darwin's word, was descent with modification. Therefore, it involved this passing of information between generations. And eventually, there is some change across those generations, and that's produced by this process of natural selection. So when we look at a branching tree like this, where we see, for instance, here where we have this one species, this is a species moving through time, and it reaches a point where there is perhaps a climate crisis or something. The population is fragmented in the bits. Many of those fragments die out, but a few of them survive. And as they survive, they're under intense selective pressure and they become different species. Eventually, you have these branchings here. And for this group up here, these four species, we call them monophyletic, meaning they have a common ancestor, and this is the ancestor here that gives rise to these four species. Some of you may have heard that we now think of birds as dinosaurs. I mean, that when I was a child, that would have been ridiculous. They're so different from one another. But it's really carrying on this same theme of classification. It turns out that birds evolved from a dinosaur. And therefore, if there was a group called dinosaurs, birds are a part of that group. They all came from a single, simple, or a single uh, original dinosaur ancestor. So that's that same idea of common descent or monophyletic descent. If I throw that five-syllable word in there, that's what I'm talking about, is that they're all grouped by descending from a single species at some point in the past. For instance, human beings are in the family, I mean, of hominidae, or the great apes, along with a number of other apes. You can see down there at the bottom, humans, which are a genus, Homo, which we share with Australopithecus, and even in the genus Homo, we have like Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis. Uh, so this grouping tells us about relatedness. All of these creatures are are related through this single ancestor up here. Same principle as we're going to use in plant classification. And classification has a number of different levels. The levels we're most familiar with are it's the species level, species and genus level. For human beings, it's the genus Homo, the species Sapiens. Um, For corn, you have Zea is the genus, Zea maize. Maize is the species, but it also belongs to the family of grasses, Poaceae. Poaceae, it belongs to the order Poales, which involves grasses and other similar plants like sedges and cattails. All of those belong to Liliopsida, which many of us know as monocots, with plants with parallel vein leaves and flowers whose parts are in threes and sixes. Magnoliophyta, which are flowering plants, and then the whole plant kingdom. So that's the many different levels to plant classification. We're going to talk mostly about families today.
I'm getting confused. What is a species, anyways?
A species is a group of living organisms, similar in genetics, appearance, and behavior, and capable of interbreeding. That seems like a good place to start.
Okay, then. What are a genus and family?
That's a really good question, Bud. It is what you think it is, and it's not quite what you think it is. Let's look at the oaks. These are just the oaks, about 500 species of oaks worldwide, but just look at the ones that are common, relatively common in McHenry County or nearby. Uh, anyone who knows anything about oaks knows we can divide them into two major groups, the white oaks and the red oaks. Common white oaks, white oak, bur oak, chinkapin oak, and swamp white oak, and you can see the list of red oaks there. And they differ because they're contrasting in their leaf types. Red oaks have a more open grained wood. They also have acorns that require 2 years to develop rather than 1 year. So there are many differences between the two groups. But the question I'm going to ask you is, well, why don't we make red oaks one genus and white oaks another genus? Why do we have them all as one genus? Well, are they indeed one genus, or are they a family with two genera? And we could be the taxonomists here, and we could declare that oaks instead are a family with two genera, red oaks and white oaks. And why did botanists decide that oak was a genus? Well, the answer to that question is that they didn't look under a microscope and find a magic feature that told them, ah, yes, oak is a genus. What they did is they looked at oaks, many different kinds of oaks, at the groupings of oaks, then they looked at what they're related to, like beeches and chestnuts. And there's some southern hemisphere beeches and oak relatives that are all in a family. And they asked themselves, how can we use these categories of genus and family and order to make sense of this in the clearest possible way that we can communicate the meaningful relationships? And so it's a decision amongst taxonomists that the oak should be a genus level and not a family level. It's not absolute. It's the judgment of of uh, of taxonomists. If you go and look at some floras done early in the 20th century, you can find that some taxonomists did make these into two different genera, Leucobalanus and Erythrobalanus, but that's not how we do it today and hasn't been that way for a long time. So it's really the judgment of how you use this whole classification scheme to clearly reflect the relationships amongst groups of plants. And so they're somewhat flexible in how you apply them, but once they're applied, taxonomists come to an understanding of how to use these groupings to explain plant relationships. So when we look at some of the more numerous families of plants in the world, we can see that there's a huge difference. And if we looked at these are only the biggest ones, we could go all the way out to families of plants that have single digits in numbers of species. And so why, why, why wouldn't we divide them up to where each group had the same number of things? But there are several reasons for that. For one, if you have two experts may disagree on what genera to include in a family, and if revised, and we'll get some examples where families have been revised quite drastically in the last 15 years. When you revise a family, it can get smaller or larger, so the size of a family is in part influenced just simply by the goals and strategies of the taxonomist. Like the family of ferns Polypodiaceae, which used to include 15 genera of ferns in the Chicago region. Almost all of our ferns were in one family. Now that family only has one genus, and it's Polypodium. So we're a radical change in the definition of the family changes its size. The second thing is that it could be that all members of the family have properties in common that allow them to adapt to certain ecological opportunities. I mean, maybe that fits our idea that maybe some plants are better or more better adapted, at least to a particular situation. For instance, grasses
Go ahead.
evolved relatively recently, and they evolved at the same time as grazing animals, ungulate grazing animals, which specialize in eating grasses, and the grasses themselves, which have a peculiar property the grass you mow in your lawn, the growth point of the blade is right at the base. And so you can keep mowing it off and it just keeps pushing the blade upward. Whereas most flowering plants, the growth point is at the tip. And so every time you mow the lawn, you'd be mowing the terminal bud off. So, and that adaptation of grasses wasn't to lawnmowers, it was originally to grazing animals. And so grasses and some other closely related plants like sedges evolved and diversified tremendously with grazing animals, 100 million years ago or so. A third thing is that it could be that reproductive biology of the members of a family make it more likely that populations of one species will diverge from other members, creating a new species. This is probably best exemplified in orchids. A species of orchid often, not always, but often is pollinated by one single insect species. And likewise, the insect species only pollinates that one kind of orchid. Well, if you think about that, any mutation in the population of insects where you have an insect now that slightly changes its floral recognition pattern could isolate a population of orchids that were formerly interbreeding with a larger population. Now orchids that have this very slight variation now become a separate group that are pollinated by this slightly different insect. And so that population of orchid has an opportunity then to evolve separate from the others. It appears to have been that with orchids because it's a group of plants that are incredibly numerous, even though they're not particularly numerous in
Okay.
any particular place on the earth.
Okay. I think I understand the family, genus, and species thing. Sort of like sisters, first cousins, and second cousins.
All right, then, I think we're ready to look at some real plant families, Tom.
Okay. Questions? Anyone have any questions at this point? This has been pretty general stuff, but I don't want to leave anyone behind at this point. Okay. Some plant families we're going to look at today. I've kept this list relatively short because I don't want to go through them quickly. There'll be some people amongst you who are kind of new to this, and if I could go through twice as many, I could only spend half as much time on each one, and I'd rather go through them and give you a real sense of what family relationships are like in plants. Let's look at the lily family first. This is not an especially large family, though 4,000 species is certainly not small. It used to be 4,000 species and 240 genera. Now it's been refigured and it's only 700 species and 15 genera. This is one of those examples where taxonomists through molecular biology, have reorganized classification. So if you buy one of those books on Amazon, the lily family might still be very large. And I'll give you some examples of genera that have moved back and forth recently. Lilies evolved probably 60 million years ago. So that's really just after the Cretaceous extinction and the disappearance of dinosaurs and the evolution of rapid evolution of mammals. Most lilies are typically spring flowering plants and they're monocots. And we'll talk a little bit more about monocots here in a second. Parallel vein leaves, and parallel means something a little bit different than parallel lines in geometry. We'll look at some examples of that. Lily family is the flowers were called three meris, or three meris means three of everything, or three or six, and multiples of three. So lily family is three sepals, three petals, six stamens, and an ovary made up of three carpels. And we're going to talk about what a carpel is here in a second. That's a word that's probably strange to you. You've probably heard of sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. The pistil is made up of carpels, and we'll talk about that in just a second.
Wait a minute. You mean thousands of species of monocots all have three sepals and three petals?
That's right, and it's because the founding species that gave rise to all monocots had three sepals, three petals, and 3 to 6 stamens, and 3 parts to the ovary.
But why not 4 or 5? Why 3? Is 3 or 6 better than 4 or 5? But there must be a reason, mustn't there?
Well, why do you have blue eyes? They're no better or worse than brown eyes.
Well, because I inherited them from my mom and dad. Oh, I see. That makes sense.
Back to you, Tom.
We haven't told Bud yet that he has brown eyes. It's keeping it secret from him. Let's look at the at lilies. They're some of the more pretty spring flowers. Often not always, but often each flower is fairly large. Michigan lily is just a gorgeous native lily of prairies and wetlands in our area. Trout lilies are super abundant in the woods in springtime. This is a typical diagram botanists might represent a plant by. So these are the sepals, the brown on the outside. Next step in are petals. The next step in are stamens, and in the center is the pistil, and it's made up in this case of 3 carpels. Um, let's talk a little bit about flower structure and where it comes from and how carpels formed, how these things formed. If we go back to the origin of flowering plants, they appear to have evolved from plants that had fertile leaves. Fertile meaning they produced male spores or female spores um, on different leaves. Now, um, as soon as you involve uh, those spores mature and become pollen grains, and the pollen grains have to move from one plant to another, and you have insects or birds or other animals visiting the plants, maybe to eat the leaves or to later on to maybe eat the spores. When you do that and they go from one to another, they carry them from one to another. So when you draw the parts together into a head, this primitive flower, and you put the male and female parts close together, you increase the likelihood that any animal visiting that plant will touch both male and female parts and therefore affect that movement of the male pollen grain to the fertile female leaf. And so you have that beginning of that organization. I'm going to talk about this again in a second, but all plants, all plants have the same parts: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil, and they're always in the same order. Sepals on the outside, petal, stamen, and pistil on the inside. Now, sometimes plants can lose one of those parts in evolutionary time, but they never invented any new ones. The ones that are there are always in the same order and always the same parts. The uh, the thing about a flowering plant, they're called angiosperms, and angiosperm refers to vessel. The angio part of that is vessel, sperm is the seed. The seeds are held inside of a vessel, and that vessel is formed as this fertile leaf folds over and leaves the sporangia, and then on the inside of that leaf. Obviously, when that happens, it has to develop a style and a stigma out here for the pollen grains to land on. But this is the origin of the flowering plant, where the leaf folds over, includes those female structures on the inside of the leaf in the vessel of the inside of the leaf. That's the ovary. This is an example of the 3 carpellate ovary of a lily. This started off as 3 fertile leaves that folded over and fused together. Here's the stamen, from a leafy stamen to the stamen. Mostly we see on plants today with a fine filament on one end and the anther, the pollen-bearing part, on the other, but it evolves from a fertile leaf. So all the parts of the flower evolved from a leaf. Just as a if you ever want to read an interesting and poetic uh, take on plant structures, read Goethe's The Morphology of Plants. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German intellectual and poet, wrote a beautiful book on the morphology of plants. I read it many years ago, and he talks about this, how leaves, all the plant parts are made up of leaves. These are now families of plants that used to be part of the lily family. When I first started studying plants, all of these would have been as a part of that 4,000 species lily family, not this much smaller 700 species lily family. And they bear many, many similarities. They're all three-merous flowers, parallel veined leaves. But botanists today, again, using molecular biology, they have looked at these and decided it's really better to split them off into separate families. Now let's look more at that simple flower structure. We're going to be talking about this with each of the plant families. I'm going to use the word conserve. This is a conserved structure, meaning that all flowering plants have the same structure, meaning that the very first flowering plant had this structure of sepal, petal, stamen, and pistil. That first flowering plant was an insect pollinated thing, and that has given rise to all the like, I think close to several 100,000 flowering plants in the world today, all evolved from that one common ancestor, a monophyletic group. And they all, if they have the part, it's always in the same order. Most of them, all of these parts, and if they have them, they're always in the same order. The receptacle, I'll mention that again, is just the end of the stem where the flower is attached. The anther is composed of a filament, or the stamen is composed of a filament and an anther. And we now know that the pistil is made up of carpels, and it has the ovary, are the fused carpels, and then it has a style or the stigma on the end that receives the pollen, and the style can be very short or very long depending on the flower. So I'll just mention those parts. And again, if you get confused or you've forgotten, just ask if I use one of these words later on. Oh, where does the word pistil come from? Well, it comes originally, it's thought from pestle. This is the very primitive tool going back into Stone Age peoples of grinding, grain grinding medicines, grinding herbs for flavoring food. The word pestle is also where that gave its name to the whistles, which are pisteti. It's a Czech word, and that also gave and the whistle then gave its name to the early pistols. The modern pistols don't look quite much like a whistle, but if you go back and look at some of the primitive pistols, you can see that it's that one word spelled differently in each case all comes from the same pestle, that one of the early human tools for preparing food. I should make that into a badge, I think. I put that together and thought, yeah, it's a pretty attractive badge, and wear that because that's the conserved structure of the flower: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. So when we're talking about plant families, we'll talk about the number of parts of each one of those parts, and we'll talk about the fusion of parts. So here we can have sepals that are fused together. In this one, we're not going to use that word. It's just another big giant O, nor this word. Here the sepals are separate. Here the sepals are all fused together. Here the petals are separate or free. We call them free when they're separate. And here the petals are fused together into a tube. We might call that the corolla tube. And this fused sepals would be a calyx. Stamens can be fused together at the base, or they can be fused together at the anthers. When we talk about the composite family, the daisy family has this really strange, rather beautiful, you look at it under magnification, how all the stamens that are free are separate at the base, but they join together at the anthers forming a tube. And as the flower is maturing, the female style then pushes up through this tube and branches out on top. We can also talk about the fusion of one part with a different part. So here we can have a flower where you can see that here is the ovary at the bottom. There's the style and the stigma up there. But look, the stamens seem to be fused to this one thing here. This one thing is called the hypanthium, and the hypanthium is the fusion of the sepal, the petal, and the stamen, all into one structure. So these three things, we call that adenation. They fuse together. Here is a cross section of the simple composite flower of the composite family, or Asteraceae. The ovule down here. Here is the style. And here are the anthers of the stamens. You can see the filaments attached to the inside of the corolla tube. So that's adenate to the inside of the corolla tube. It's hard to see this unless you have a really good microscope and you very carefully take out, because these flowers are very small generally. These anthers are all fused into a beautiful little tube. I love looking at plants in microscopes because the structures, we're normally used to appreciating the beauty of plants, the beauty of the eye, and that's a very real one. But as you use even a hand lens or a microscope, there's that whole other level of beauty as you get on the insides of plants and look at how they're put together. There's another example of adenation, one of them that you eat regularly. This is the apple flower, or apple. Yeah, this is the apple flower over here. And you can see that the stamen, petal, and sepal are separate and free only at the top of the ovary, which means that the sepal, petal, and stamen must be fused together and form this hypanthium that surrounds the ovary, and those three parts then separate only at the top. And it turns out this is what an apple flower looks like when it's in flower. When the fruit matures, it looks like this. You have to flip this over. But this is the ovary here. When you eat an apple, that's the ovary. Most people don't eat the core. You can actually just eat the core and spit the seeds out. Most people don't eat the core. It's a slightly different texture. All the fleshy part of the apple that you like is the hypanthium. Has developed into that soft, fleshy, and sweet material. That's the hypanthium. And often at the base of the apple, you'll find these little remnants of the calyx there, because there are the sepals, and that's left at the end of the apple on the opposite side from the stem. So if I'd flip this apple over, the stem would be on one side and this little bits of the calyx would be on the other. So there's an example of adenation. We were looking at an inferior ovary before, but I want to formally recognize this. So when we look at leg cramp there, sorry, we can look at where the ovary sits relative to the point of attachment of the petals and stamens and sepals, and if they join together below the ovary, then we call that a superior ovary. And superior doesn't mean good, and inferior doesn't mean bad. Superior means high, and inferior in this case means low. Lake Superior is the highest of the Great Lakes. That's why we called it Lake Superior. So this is a flower with a superior ovary, and this is the fruit of the flower of a superior ovary. If there were any of the calyx or sepals left, they would be here on this end, on the stem end, because the sepals, stamen, and petals would all join right here. This is just the developed ovary of the flower. And on the other case, this is an inferior ovary. This would be a cherry or a plum or a peach. This is an apple. We talked about that just now. The sepals are left, fragment of the sepals on this end, stem on the other end, and there is the core, the pulp is the hypanthium. This is the flower, with the separation of sepal, petal, and stamen only above the ovary. So this difference between inferior and superior ovary is one that it's like the next step when you're working with plants and you have to go through plant keys. It will ask you this question. It's fairly easy to evaluate. Sometimes you need a microscope or a hand lens to see it, but it's fairly simple and easy to see the difference between superior and inferior ovaries. This is a really good question, Bud. Mostly I'm going to be talking about flowers today, sometimes about leaves, because some families do have some characteristic range of leaf patterns, but um, almost all of plant taxonomy really focuses in on on the various aspects of the flower. When you wonder why that is, well, if we what we're looking for when we do classification, really classification of anything, are criteria on which to base the classification, the difference between animals and plants. Well, animals have a central nervous system. They're mobile, at least at some stage in their life. I mean, we can go through different criteria to separate plants from animals. Um, and whether you're Linnaeus or Darwin or these human beings in France 16, 17,000 years ago, your classification, you pick out criteria to classify, and you want your classification to be comprehensive, meaning that you don't leave a lot of things unclassified. Your worldview has to be totalizing. It has to tell you what's in the world and what your relationship to all these things. You don't want those classes to leave a lot of loose bits on the outside, and you want what's on the inside of each class to be at least relatively homogeneous to think relative to those that are outside. And if that's not the case, then you revise the criteria and you do it again. This is fundamental to classification. We all do it all the time as we get in new situations and we have to order things and put them into groups in order to sort of navigate that world and understand how we relate to the different classes. Just the basics of classification, and true of plant classification also. And flowers are very conservative, and I don't mean politically conservative. I mean conservative in the sense that they change relatively slowly in evolutionary time. Let's think of an example of a group of uh, of plants, and one of those members of that group has a mutation of the color gene, and instead of blue flowers, it now has red flowers. Now, red flowers might seem just as good to you and me, but if the pollinating insect doesn't recognize the red flower, then it's left out and it can't share its pollen nor receive pollen from other members of its group. And so that color of the petal can't change individually. It would have to be separated off as a smaller group and then change in that way. Whereas if one plant amongst that group just had leaves that were twice as long, giving it 4 times as much surface area, that might be quite an advantage in a newly shady environment. And that plant would grow faster, produce more flowers and more seeds in there, and that larger uh, plant or leaf patterns would then spread in that group. So the leaf variation is much more plastic and can change much more rapidly than the flowers. And so the flowers give us a much more conservative view of what's happening in plant evolution. They change more slowly and they change in concert with many other plants that are changing. Now, yeah, you're right, Emma. This has been a revolution in plant taxonomy. Those of you who are just learning your botany now won't see it as much of a revolution because you're only on one side of that. But for those of us who learned our botany 30, 40 years ago. People my age, I know, are terribly upset now that so many plants have changed their names. And they've changed their names because we've reassessed relationships based on this whole new set of information. The base pairs that make up DNA, that molecule that that contains all the information that allows a fertilized cell to make another individual like you or me. All of it comes down to these four bases in different pairs: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. All the information that constructs all of life gets down to those four different bases in different orders. And so we now have ways we can actually look in there and see the pattern of base pairs and reassess the nearest common ancestor between these two groups based on the similarity of in the DNA. And so, for instance, we've now taken the genus Desmodium, what all of us old guys would have said, well, it's a perfectly good genus, and they're all tick trefoils, and all make those little triangular seeds that stick to your socks when you walk through the woods. But no, now it's 17 different genera. So pretty radical breakup of a familiar genus. With other things like oaks, molecular biology has given us a new way of looking at some problems like the relationships between scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea, Hills oak, Quercus ellipsoideus, and black oak, Quercus velutina. It's still a complicated, messy group, but we've got more information on how to think about those three different species based on new information from molecular biology. I know some people my age who've just refused and they've boycotted the new naming system. I'm still flexible enough. I realize I have to go along, but if you've if you've worked really hard and become very good at a set of names for 30 years of your life and someone changes it, you get upset. Um, but we have to understand that names in the way we normally use them in life, like my name or your name, stays stable because most of us want to be recognized by people that know us, and so we keep the same name. It's a convenient label for clear communication, you know. But the scientific names for plants are more than just that communication of a group. Rather, the name contains a whole set of complex and obscure, often obscure relationships are contained in the name. And so the name has to change as our understanding of plant groupings change. It's the difference between a science and a common system of naming. Common names haven't changed. They've remained relatively stable. They're not as precise, but they remain stable because we just use them to talk to one another. And I point at something and call it a white oak, and it's still a white oak. All right, let's look at another plant family. This is a beautiful plant family. I mean, there's only one native species of iris in our area, but the flowers are so beautiful and there's so wonderfully put together. I wanted to include this family. About 1,500 species in the world, even though we only have one that's locally native. Um, Again, it's a monocot, so the flowers are three meris, three sepals, three petals, three stamens, and a three carpellate inferior ovary. Now remember, carpellate means the ovary was made from three folded leaves, all fused together into an ovary today, and the ovary is inferior. What does that mean? It means the sepals and the petals and the stamens all attach on top of the ovary, and so the ovary is surrounded by the hypanthium, the fusion of all of those parts. The leaves are two-ranked, which means they're either, if you put the plant in front of you, the plants would go left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right as you go up the stem. Fruit is a capsule, and these are mostly plants of open, sunny areas. The word iris comes from the Greek god of the rainbow. And it referred to the color, which is the reason why we then call the colored part of the eye the iris. And it's I guess because iris is, at least particularly in the old world, and particularly at higher elevations in the mountains, they're a very diverse group and of many different colors. And so all of these go back, the word iris goes back to the colors, the diversity of colors of plants in that family. All right. Now, when you look at this, it looks like it's got about 8 or 9 petals, doesn't it? All these beautiful colored parts, but they're not. This biggest colored part here on the base is the sepal. Now, often monocots, the sepals and petals will all have a similar look to it. The blue-eyed grass, the Scissorincum, the blue-eyed grass, a relatively common prairie grass or prairie plant in our area. You can see sepal and petal are identical here. Sometimes we call them tepals when they're identical. They're not identical in the iris, but they are all sort of petaloid. They all look like petals. Again, you have to count from the outside in. Sepal. Actually, the next step in are these things up here. Those are the petals. And what comes after that? Sepal, petal, stamen. So the next thing going in is this curved structure here. That has to be the stamen. Even though it doesn't look like a stamen, it has to be or excuse me. Nope. What this is, the next step going in is actually right here. Under that, this structure here, this folded structure that I just mistakenly called the stamen, is actually the pistil, and under it, so just outside of it, is the stamen hidden just below this flap here. So we have sepal, petal, the stamen underneath, and this is the pistil. Even though it doesn't look like a pistil, it looks like 3 leaves. This part is the style, and this part, this folded flap here, is the stigma. So this is the part that would receive the pollen. As a pollinator lands and goes up this sepal, it would run into here and it would contact this flap of the pistil and deposit the pollen, and then pick up pollen from this plant, from the stamen underneath, really the petaloid style here. So that's a fascinating structure of the iris family. That you take those conserved parts of the flower, sepal, petal, stamen, pistil, and make them into something that's incredibly beautiful and very confusing, frankly. And there's our 3-carpellate ovary that then matures into a capsule bearing seeds. There's our style, stigma, and stamen. And there's 2 ranking is probably best reflected here in this pair of bracts and a pair of a bract is a leaf-like organ in association with flowers. General word for when you look at a flower and you look at these odd little leaf-like things that are right in the immediate vicinity of the flowers, you generally call those bracts. Here, these 2 bracts form a spathe, and they're opposite one another like 2 folded hands surrounding the stem. Any questions at this point?
Remember, your options are to unmute yourself or to type in the chat. I know for every time I see the evolution of the carpal image, it's like kind of mind-blowing there. Just seeing it get simpler over time and kind of pushed together.
One of the often a misconception about evolution, and we tend to think of evolution, I guess because we live in a society that's obsessed with progress. We think of evolution as sort of a natural predecessor of our technological progress, and that evolution progressed from simple to complex. But not really. I mean, it did in one sense. I mean, we started with single cells and we ended up with human beings. In another podcast, I could talk about that. But with plant evolution, often it goes exactly the opposite. You go from complicated looking things with many parts to very few parts, all fused together into a very simple looking structure. So plant evolution often has sort of seemingly gone in reverse from complex to simple, um, to create things that have fewer parts than the original its evolutionary progenitor. Let's look at grasses. Now, grasses are flowering plants. Often when I'm, teaching a course to beginners, they will look at me with a kind of a puzzle. Like, well, obviously grasses don't have flowers. Flowers are colored and they're pretty and bees visit them. But the grass flower is just very tiny, and we'll look at some examples of grass flowers here in a minute. Um, but it's a peculiar group of plants, as I said earlier, that evolved, at least diversified, at the same time as grazing animals, and particularly ungulates. So we can look at the structure of grasses. The leaves are two ranked. Again, right, left, right, left. Now this, often when you look at a grass, you won't see this. I find these sorts of things fascinating. So I'm often, when I'm out in the field, will pick a stem and just stare at it. So if you ever see me do that, I'm not going crazy. I just like to look for these things because I find it marvelous that something simple like that is repeated over and over and over and over and over again with every single grass in the world. This two ranking, this left, right. Now, sometimes the stem sort of twists as it grows, and so you have to use your imagination a little. But if you compare them to sedges, which are three ranked, they're really quite different. And it's usually an easy way to tell the two groups of plants apart. Many sedges have a sort of grass-like look to them. The stems are hollow on grasses. If you've ever cut a piece of bamboo or really cleanly snipped off a stem of big blue stem and look, you'll see the stem is hollow, it's round. Uh, where the leaf joins the stem, this is a leaf, but this is also a leaf. The leaf continues down along the stem, and it's called the sheath. And this is unusual in plants. Typically, we think of the leaf as being attached to the stem with a petiole or maybe directly to the stem. But with grasses, the bottom of the leaf is actually wrapped around the stem. And you have to follow that sheath, that little tube of leaf, all the way down to the next, essentially little lump in the stem called the node. This is very simple. There's the blade part of the leaf, and this is the sheath that surrounds the stem and actually attaches to the stem at the node. This is like the point of attachment of an oak leaf to a twig. The oak leaf attaches the twig at a node. This is the node on a grass. The leaf attaches, but then wraps around the stem and doesn't stretch out a blade that would really capture a lot of sunlight until some distance up the stem. Here you can see a close-up. This is the sheath. The stems of grasses are open, so you can peel them back away from the sheath if you look closely and try it. And the ligule, let's see, there's the ligule. The ligules can be very small, they can be large, they can be a lot of different shapes, but you look for the ligule, it's a funny little structure that occurs where the blade and the sheath join. All of this is one leaf, but it's where the blade and the sheath join on the inside, you'll find these ligules. And the shape and the size and the structure of the ligule is often a good identification character when you start working with grasses. Here is the flower of grasses. This is the reason why you didn't think grasses had flowers, is because they're very, very tiny. But they're probably easiest to see. Well, if you let your grass in your yard go to seed, you'll see the little fluffy part come up. Kentucky bluegrass has a little open panicle. Uh, and if you looked with a magnifying glass, uh, and you keep looking every day at that little fluffy panicle, you'd eventually see these little yellow stamens poking out and dangling in the breeze. Generally, the female part of the flower, the ovary and the stigma are small and not exerted, or so little exerted from the flower you can't see them, but they're there. This In this case, the sepals and petals seem to have disappeared in evolutionary time, and there are a couple of lumps at the base of a grass flower we call them loticules. It presumably are the evolutionary remnants. So there are no sepals and petals. We simply have the sexual parts, stamen and pistil. The pistil is made up of three fused carpels, all into one um, container ovary. Uh, and this, let's see, I've got another one here. This is a grass flower that has, it doesn't have sepals and petals, but it does have lemmas and pallias, or sometimes the pallia is called a lemma. These are two specialized tiny little bracts. We don't use the word bract in this case, but there are little modified leaves that occur in association with this grass flower. There you see the stigma of the flower. Uh, and they surround and enclose the flower when it's developing, and then they come apart. They allow the anthers to exert and disperse pollen and the stigma to receive pollen. This is windborne pollen, so doesn't require insect pollination in this case. So in this case, this is an example where we think of insect pollination as advanced, and plants have been getting a partnership with animals to disperse pollen. But a number of flowering plants, many of our trees, grasses, sedges, have reverted to wind pollination. Uh, um, Essentially all grasses, I don't like to say all because there are too many grasses and probably one of them hasn't. And certainly there are many trees that retain insect pollination, but uh, wind pollination is still common amongst flowering plants, but it's an advanced character, meaning it's derived from an insect pollinated ancestor, because we know obviously all flowering plants evolved from a single ancestor, a common ancestor, a monophyletic group. So they all start off as insect pollinated plants. And the derived form, the more highly evolved form, is the wind pollinated plant today. It seems a little reverse, but here's a case where plants have simplified.
Hey, Tom, we got a question for you.
Okay.
How are sedges 3 ranked?
How?
Yeah,
Uh,
maybe show that picture again.
um, the ranking of leaves is a property of all flowering plants. With with trees, I'll talk about uh, the leaves on oaks are have five ranks. In other words, if I get an oak twig and look at it, it will be you'll see the oak leaves coming off of that twig in five different positions. They're spirally arranged, but each time there's a leaf, it's in one of those five positions. Here, the leaves are spirally arranged, but each time a leaf occurs, it's occurring in one of those three positions that are 120 degrees apart. An elm tree is two ranked, like a grass. The leaves are either on one side or the other, back and forth, back and forth. So it's a property of, it must be a property of the developing terminal bud of a stem as it's growing out. It's creating a node and a leaf primordia in certain positions and at certain frequencies as that plant grows. It would seem like why wouldn't they just have leaves anywhere and everywhere? I don't know the answer to that question, but all plants have a regular, the fancy word, you always want to have fancy words in store to impress family and friends. The fancy word for that is phyllotaxy. And all plants have a phyllotaxy, a regularity to their position of their leaves um, on the plant. And yeah, it turns out that as a good identification character, the whole sedge family are three ranked, and the whole grass family are two ranked. That's not really an answer to the question of why, but it's simply a way of saying that, yep, they're all plants have a regularity to their leaf arrangements. And the individual flowers, floret, we would call it here, or the ET is just small. The small flower surrounded by its lemma and palea then occurs in a spikelet. Um, and so they're organized on the uh, the inflorescence, the flowering part of the plants. You will see spikelets, and the spikelets will have sometimes only one floret, sometimes they'll have many florets as a part of that spikelet. Next, let's look at the legume family. This is a really one of the reasons I'm focusing on, in this case, big families, because there are a lot of legumes, and once you recognize it's a legume, that gives you a really good head start for doing your plant identification. This is the typical flower pattern of legumes. It's called the papilionaceous. There's a lot of syllables there. Papilionaceous, or butterfly-like pattern of legume flowering. Essentially, all of our native species of legumes in this county are papilionaceous. We do have some Illinois bundleflower, which is in this very different group, the mimosoid group. And the mimosoid group is different because it has a very different flower structure, and then they're all sort of spherically arranged on these heads. We don't have to worry about that. We don't really have any plants like that in our area. Likewise, there's another group, a small group of legumes of the sessilpinioid. Botanists just love multisyllabic terms. And these are pretty plants. They're in the Chicago area. I don't think they're native right in McHenry County, but they're nearby with a very different flower pattern. But let's just go back and talk more about just these papilionaceous flowers. You can see that they have 5 petals. They have the standard or banner that sticks up, the wings that stick out to either side, and then a keel, which are 2 petals fused together into like the keel of a boat. Same with goat's roost, same with redbud trees, same flower pattern, like peas and beans in your garden, or here is a white clover in your yard, beautiful white prairie clover, Dahlia candida, has beautiful little papilionaceous white flowers, very tiny. Uh, I notice a lot of people don't, but that's why I carry a magnifying glass with. I can recognize a white prairie clover, but I still like to look at the details. But again, because again, there's that whole unfolding realm of beauty that you can't really appreciate with the naked eye, at least not certainly with my naked eyes. They're getting worse as I get older. Um, One of the villains of the Chicago area, Birdfoot trefoil, beautiful little flower. It's just a real pain in the what to prairie restorationists. It's a very rapidly reproducing plant that infests prairies and can really cause calamities with prairie restorations. But you see that same pattern here, the the uh, the keel, the standard there. It's a little hard to see the wings on this. I think they're just pressed tight to the keel. Pale vetchling, a very rare prairie plant. Again, same pattern. Once you learn that pattern, you'll immediately recognize the legume family. That gives you a real heads up or a real head start in taking it to the next level. Now, in this case, legumes do have some commonality to leaves. It's not perfect, but at least most legumes will have compound leaves, meaning it is made up of several different leaflets. White clover, black medic, really common lawn weed uh, that is in your yard. It has tiny little heads of yellow flowers. White clover has a somewhat larger head of white flowers, still small. Uh, the pale vetchling is compound. These are sort of three compound leaves. Here are pinnately compound leaves and vetch, a number of different vetches in our area. Pale vetchling, different genus, but also has a compound leaf. But you can get simple leaf legumes like redbud trees, perfectly leguminous legume, but it has simple leaves. And we can have palmately compound leaves like lupin, beautiful lupin of sand prairies, and at least where I've seen it most commonly is in the Indiana Dunes National Park on the sand dunes there. Just gorgeous flowers. If you catch it in flower spikes of big, beautiful blue papilionaceous flowers. And I love little obscure characters. And the pulvini or pulvinus, singular, are these swellings at the end of the leaf. Now, next time you go out into your yard and you see some white clover, uh, if you have old eyes like mine, a magnifying glass is useful. If you have young, good eyes, you can probably see this pretty easily. Right where the stem or the petiole of the leaf joins a stem will be a swelling. And often there is a swelling where the stem joins the leaf. And you wonder, well, what's that about, Tom? Well, it's actually a point that at least on some legume species where that pulvini allows or pulvinus allows the plant to change the orientation of the leaf relative to sunlight. So it's actually a functional structure on legumes. Not that other plants can't change their leaf orientations, but with legumes, that change in orientation is done mostly by these pulvini at either the top or the base or the end of this leaf stalk. And the legume family is really named for the fruits. There's an amazing regularity, even though the flowers can be different. This is the honey locust flower, big, long pod. The white clover pods are very, very tiny. Some of these clovers have pods that only have one seed in them, but it's still a legume pod. There's that really weird mimosa flower, but it has a legume pod that looks really very much like other legumes. The round-headed bush clover, a native clover of our prairies, has a small single-seeded pod. All right, so there's the legume families. It's a fairly easy family to recognize. That's one step in plant identification. From there, then as you start to learn the legumes, then you'll start to learn to separate off the uh, the true clovers in the trifolium group from the medics and alfalfa um, in that group, still three leaves from all these other groups. So by learning these groupings and separating the groupings, you can help yourself later on and reinforce your recognition of species. The carrot family is I think, supposedly in the stories that I've heard, this could be apocryphal, but it was told to me by a good botanist that he said that this was the very first family of plants that was recognized in European botany that still holds together today as a family. And it's kind of easy to see why, because the flowers occur in umbels. They're sometimes spherical and sometimes flat top. Um, but it makes the whole family fairly easy to recognize. Fairly big family of 3,700 species. Lots of herbs and some foods in this family. Uh, Yeah, carrots, celery, typical table vegetables you might eat raw. Silphium is an ancient carrot family plant. Now, that word today we use as a genus in the composite family, but the ancient Greeks used that word to refer to a special uh, plant in the carrot family that was used for herbal and medicinal purposes. And it was thought to be extinct, but recently a Turkish botanist, they think, has rediscovered that plant that was at the time of the ancient Greeks called Silphium. And this is the flower, the tiny flower in those big umbellate arrays. And we'll talk more about the umbel here in just a second. It's, look at this. Here's the ovary. It's got a hypanthium. Sepal, petal, and stamen are joined at the top of the ovary. And then the stigma, style, and stigma are poking out of the top here. So is that an inferior or a superior ovary? What do you think? Sepal, petal, and stamen are joined at the top of the ovary. Well, that would be an inferior ovary. The ovary is below, inferior to the point of attachment. Were those sepal, petal, and stamen attached here, the ovary would be superior or above the point of attachment. There's the tiny, tiny little white flowers of the wild carrot, an introduced plant, and it's not generally a problem weed in natural areas management, but it can mostly a plant of waste places, but occasionally it can populations you get large enough we might need to control it in a prairie restoration. And this is the fruit. The fruit is two carpels. Remember, two folded leaves made up the original ovary of the carrot family. And it splits apart into two pieces. Again, overload of terminology, but again, you can impress family and friends at dinner. If you're eating carrots, you can talk about how the fruit is a schizocarp composed of two mericarps, splits into two mericarps, and schizo simply means splitting, and meri means part. So I remember a botanist telling me that once. Is a schizocarp composed of two mericarps. I thought, wow, that's almost a poem. Uh, so let's look at the umbel, the way these flowers are arranged. A simple umbel is this picture here in the center. All the flowers are joined at a same point. Now we can look at we'll look at some other flower structures that end up being flat topped or round topped, but they don't all join at the same point, and we'll typically call those a corymb. But this is an umbel where they all join at the same point, or actually most of the carrot family plants that we actually find out in the landscape have compound umbels. So it's an umbel of umbels, small umbel, big umbel. That would be true of wild carrot, cow parsnip. They're umbels of smaller umbels. One of the leaf characteristics that I actually find useful. Leaf characters, when you have them, are useful because the leaves are out really in the early spring. The flower may wait months in order to come out. And so leaf characters can help you on identification when the flowers either aren't out or haven't developed enough to use them. At the base of the leaf in the Apiaceae or the carrot family, it has this big sheath-like base. It's not a sheath like a grass that surrounds the stem, although it may partially enclose the stem right at the base. That sheath-like opening or a sheath-like base to the leaf is fairly easy to recognize, and it's symptomatic of the Apiaceae. And I have many times looking at little green things in the springtime seen that, and that immediately narrows down my choices and helps me to because once I know it's in that group, I can then look at some other features and perhaps be able to recognize it all the way to species. Celery, remember how it gets wide at the base? That's because it's in the carrot family, and that's the sheathing base of the leaf. So the next time you eat celery, um, you'll have to think about that. Point that out to whoever you're eating the celery with, that that's characteristic of the APACE. I can remember, I have to relate this story. It's not much about botany, but when I was a little boy, I was sitting at, we were having a family dinner. And at the family dinner, the kids all had to sit at a separate table because we were rambunctious. And at that table, we all had celery and we started eating celery. And you know how celery makes a really loud sound when you eat it? We all started looking at each other and biting into the celery. And each time someone bit, we started laughing. And then we kept biting into the celery and laughing. And pretty soon the whole table of little boys was laughing about eating celery. I'll never forget that moment. I still like celery. Um, all right, so let's look just at some examples of plants in the carrot family. There's our familiar plant of carrot family. And the carrot family, depending when you look at it in the development of that flower head, you'll find the little purple sterile flower in the middle. Why it's there? Presumably, it's for pollinator recognition, though I don't know much more about it than that. That is true of all carrot family. If you look at it at the wrong stage of development, you won't be able to find that. But when it's fully open, that little purple flower will be there. Uh, the whoops, no, this looks suspiciously like poison hemlock. I mean, yes, those two look very different, but if you look at 10 pictures of poison hemlock and 10 pictures of wild carrot, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap in the appearance of that umbel. Wild carrots are technically edible, and in the carrot I've always found them rather woody. Maybe I just haven't need to prepare them properly or cook them, but they have a wonderful carrot odor. Poison hemlock on the other side is deadly poisonous, and there are a handful of people every year that die thinking they're eating wild carrots and they chew into a poison hemlock. So please don't do that. Make sure you know I'm one to nibble on plants all the time when I'm outdoors, but uh, I only nibble things that I know what they are. Um, uh, and on the other side, we've got wild parsnip and golden Alexander, the flowers of which look surprisingly similar. And so, really, the leaves, I'm going to go past that to these leaves here. These leaves are really the best way to tell those two apart. And again, this is an important one to tell apart because this one is phototoxic, meaning if you get the juice on your flesh and it's exposed to sunlight, it'll cause blistering, at least in almost everyone that I've met. Golden Alexander is a beautiful native plant that doesn't do that. So it's important to be able to tell those two apart. Now, this is an unusual carrot family plant because it doesn't have an umbel, does it? It has a head. Well, in general in evolution, the common feature is primitive. So in this family Apiaceae, what's common amongst almost all of them is the umbel-like arrangement of flowers. So that has to be the primitive structure in the Apiaceae, and this is the evolved structure. But how do you get there? Well, it's really a fairly simple step of drawing together all of these flowers closer and closer and closer together into a head. And why would you do that? Well, it's the same reason you might have drawn together flowers that were scattered over a whole plant into this flat-topped inflorescence. And that is that when an insect visits this, it walks across the top of the inflorescence and potentially pollinates many plants. And the more you draw those flowers together, the more spatially closely associated they are, the more effective is the visit of one pollinator to pollinating many plants. So perhaps what it's telling us is that it's the rarity of pollinators, at least in certain years at certain times, that's important to plant reproduction, and they're trying to make a most efficient use of those pollinator visits. There's the leaves of poison hemlock, and again, they're not the same, but they're too close for comfort, if you know what I mean. So be sure before you chew on things. Um, there's there it is again. You don't see the sepals here. The thing I find most interesting about this is that more than most any other plant family, that same pattern, the flowers in the mustard family are almost all alike other than color and size. And this is 3/4 of an inch across and this is an 1/8 of an inch across, but the structures look exactly the same, 4, 6, 2, 4 sepals. So it's so easy to recognize a mustard family plant by that conserved 4-petal, 4-sepal, 6-stamen flower structure. Easy one to recognize. The fruits of the mustard family uh, are either these long, skinny things like garlic mustard or hedge mustard uh, that are called siliques, or they're these flat, more disc or heart-shaped, in the case of shepherd's purse, that we call silicles. But again, they're always divided into two parts. They then split open to release the seeds. The mustard, all the leaves of the entire mustard family, as far as I know, are edible. Almost all the ones I've ever tried are peppery in flavor. Likewise, the seeds are peppery in flavor. Mustard, I think, is made from a preparation of the seeds of one of these plants. And this is a big, beautiful family to go through. Huge family of plants, and yet there is, again, these conserved structures in families of plants that I find, I still, at this, having worked with plants for decades of my life, I still find this amazing and beautiful that you have 30 some thousand species that all have these same conserved relationships of structures. The full composite flower has disc flowers. They're tiny little symmetrical disc flowers, and then these big floppy ray flowers on the outside, mimicking a simple flower head. So it looks like this would be the petal, and this would be like the pistils on the inside, but that's not the case. These are separate flowers, and this is a separate flower, and it's all joined together into a head surrounded by what are called filaries, or or um, involucral bracts. The involucre is this whole structure that encloses this head. Again, you can see how in the evolution of a flower head, you go from separate flowers by reducing all of these little pedicels, getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, you eventually arrive at a head. So here is the corym. This is probably the simple structures that in the aster family would have been the simple structures that were reduced and produced this head-like structure that we find in the composite flower head today. This is Heliopsis. We can see that here are the disc flowers in the center, ray flowers on the outside, and we can see the green involucral bracts below that. And where we see these little branched stigmas, that shows us that these ray flowers are fertile. They can produce seed. And when we see the branched stigmas up here in the disc flowers are fertile and can produce seed. Here is a close-up of a disc flower. We looked at that earlier when we were talking about the ednation of parts. Here is the floral tube of 5 petals that are fused together into a tube. There are the separate filaments of the stamens that are attached to the inside of the floral tube and then fused in the anthers. And there's the female part that grows through the hollow in that anther tube and then branches out to receive pollen from other plants. Just a little schematic. The fruit of all of the aster family are achenes, or little nuts, nutlets, or achenes, sometimes big in the case of a sunflower that you eat, sometimes much smaller, like the little triangular. If you walk in wetlands, you have these genus of plants called bidens that have sometimes called Spanish combs. Here is the achene of the biden's flower, and the modified sepals of the flower become these little spiky things that eventually grab onto your socks. Those little the sepals of the in this case, this is an aster achene, and you can see the sepals have become the little hairs that allow the seed to float on the wind. Same with the dandelion. Here is a dandelion flower, or I think it's actually, yeah, that's dandelion. Pappus are the modified sepals. Inside of the pappus then are the petals, modified sepals, here's the petals. Here is the staminal tube where the anthers are fused together. The style punches through that and then branches out on top. So we have heads of only ray flowers, these asymmetrical ray flowers here, as opposed to heads that have both ray and disc flowers. Again, we have a whole group of composites that have these ray flower only heads. Now, in these, where all the flowers are alike, the flowers are both male and female. On plants like the Heliopsis, the ray flowers are only female. The ray flowers are never male. Sometimes the disc flowers in this group of composites can be both male and female, or they can be only male. They can't be only female. These can be only, yeah. So this is one of those ways that you take a fairly simple conserved structure and then make 33,000 different species that have different combinations of all of these features that seem in themselves pretty simple, but you can combine them in so many different ways. Here's an interesting difference. These are the cone flowers. Here's pale purple coneflower and the yellow coneflower. The receptacle on which all of these disc flowers attach is cone shaped. That's the reason for calling it coneflower, as opposed to a sunflower that has a more or less flat receptacle. It's not perfectly flat, but it's pretty close to flat. If you look at a dandelion, it's practically a flat receptacle. Coneflower has these elongate cone-shaped receptacles. Here's a variation on the fertile and sterile theme. Here are the silphiums, so are prairie dock and compass plant and rosin weed. The ray flowers are female and fertile, so all the seeds will be in a ring around the outside of this flower head. The disc flowers, you can see the ovary really doesn't develop here. It only produces pollen. So it's fertile in a sense, but when we talk about fertility and sterility in the Asteraceae, we're really talking about whether or not it's female. So the male, we call it sterile flowers in the middle. They're not sexually sterile. They're male. They produce pollen. It's the ray flowers that produce the seeds. Here we have the coreopsis, which has sterile ray flowers and fertile disc flowers. So in this case, we know ray flowers, meaning sterile, they never have stamens, so they don't have stamen or pistil. So the disc flowers are both male and female. And it has an interesting, the coreopsis, the involucre of flowering plants is often distinctive, and when you go through a flowering plant key, it will refer to the involucre. Coreopsis is rather unusual in that it has two rather neat, well, actually three rather neat whorls of bracts that make this up. There's one, two, and then a third one that's slightly colored on the inside. All of those are bracts that make up that involucre in the Coreopsis genus, as opposed to Helianthus. This just has a sort of uh, um, spirally arranged group of leaf-like bracts. Some composite heads are disc only, disc flowers only, and no ray flowers. And probably their most really highly evolved flowering aster plants are things like ragweed, which has separated male and female flower heads. And it's the male ones, obviously, that produce the pollen in copious amounts in these long spikes of male flowers. This is my nemesis in the late summer. Or, and there's the close-up female. Here's the involucre, and it's just a conserved structure. It's the involucre, the head of the tiny, in this case, little five-lobed male flowers that are just like every other disc flower, only this case, only male. And even the cocklebur, which you wouldn't pick out as a composite plant, and yet it is. This is the involucre. The involucral bracts have become the hook spines of the cocklebur. Fascinating way that you take these same simple parts and create 30,000 different species. I'm going to skip, be close to the end here. I want to skip and just do these last few families quickly. This is the buttercup family, a fairly primitive family with often many parts. So we have many stamens. In the genus Ranunculus, or the buttercups, it's only 5 petals, but in other members of the family, you can have many petals. The ovary is always many different separate carpels that mature into many little separate achenes. Typically, the leaves have a sort of palmate venation or compound leaves. You see these sort of branch out. They're not sort of pinnately veined like a feather. They branch out more like the fingers of your hand. There's again an ovary, many different separate little carpels in the primitive primitive pistil of Ranunculaceae. Some plants in the family have berries for fruit. Here's an odd one. This is I think I've got a picture. Yeah, this is an odd one. The plant, first of all, the plant's upside down. The sepals look like little red leaves, and the petals have big spikes that go up. If you flip the plant right side up, they would go down. The stamens and pistil are on the inside. And then it creates follicles with lots of little seeds. Just a gorgeous plant, spring flowering, or sort of late spring flowering plant of our woodlands here. And this is another member of the Ranunculaceae. Again, many different carpels, all separate from one another. It falls apart at maturity. Many different stamens in a leaf that's sort of hand-like in its compound nature. I wanted to go through these quickly at the end, just because they're so different from other flowering plants. This is pine. They're seeds, but Why is this different from a flowering plant? It has cones instead of flowers. And a flowering plant is an angiosperm, and angio means vessel. And so I said earlier, there's no vessel that contains this seed. It's just sitting on the top of a cone scale. Um, and as it matures, even though the seed looks like a maple seed, the maple seed is the matured ovary of a maple flower. And this is simply a seed that matures on a cone scale, and a little bit of the cone scale peels off to leave a wing to allow the seed to fly through the air. So these conifer plants, of which Pinaceae is one group, evolved around 350 million years ago. Flowering plants waited well over another 100 million years before the first flowering plants occurred. So these are a much more ancient group of plants. Um, Fertilization and development of the embryo takes much longer in these. And the leaves, which we've all grown up calling these needles, you can see that we have some like hemlock that have a pretty distinct petiole. We have others like fir that look like little leeches attached to the twig. The leaves are all separate here. Same with spruces, where the leaves actually attach to a tiny little woody stub that comes out that's really a part of the stem and not the leaf. And in pines, they occur in groups we call fascicles. And each fascicle is actually a branch. It's a miniature branch that has evolved into this specialized structure that holds anywhere from 1 to 5 leaves. Fascinating group of plants. I used to teach a lot of conifer courses when I worked at the Arboretum many years ago. Um, Not the case anymore. I get lonely for conifers sometimes. And lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about ferns, another group of plants. It's not terribly diverse in our area, but when you get into wetlands, you start to see quite a few of them if you know where to look. These don't have seeds either. They don't have flowers or seeds. What they have, well, I was going to answer that question here, bud. The the They create spores, and the spores are dispersed. Let's look. The spores are dispersed. They germinate. They grow into this little green thing called a gametophyte. Doesn't look anything like this. It grows into this. This creates these two structures, more botanical names, Antheridia and Archegonia, that produce sperm and eggs. The sperm, during rainfall, when there's wetness, the sperm swim from the Archegonia to the Antheridia to the Archegonia of a nearby gametophyte, fertilize it, and out of that little gametophyte grows the next generation of spore-producing plants. So it alternates between spore-producing plant and gamete-producing plant. That, bud, is how they reproduce without seeds. Fascinating group of plants. The sporangia, the little spore-bearing structures, are generally in sori clusters, and the sori are usually, with most, covered with a thin skin called the indusium. And the shape and the number and the size of these sori and the yeah are of those identification features are used to recognize the ferns. Fascinating group of plants. So, there's a lot of plant families makes plant ID. It both makes it easier, and for me, it makes it more satisfying, because in identifying plants, I'm identifying them within a group and understanding their relationship to other plants around them and other plants that I've seen in other places. But practically speaking, you can learn to recognize those features like the boviny of plants, or the umbels of carrot family plants, or the the involucre of an aster family plant. Once you learn to recognize that, you can recognize the group, and then maybe you can recognize the genus, and then going all the way to species become much more easy. Uh, For me, understanding plant classification has been a part of understanding plant evolution, which I find at historical depth has really appreciated or really increased my appreciation of plants and just the diversity of plants on the world today. Um, don't ever forget common names. Molecular biology may be continuing. It's not over. It's not like molecular biology happened and now we're set. In the next 15 years, if I live that long, there'll be more changes and they're going to come whenever scientists find out new things about relationships, common names. Don't ever forget those. And when you're talking to people that don't know anything about plants, use the common name. Scientific names are just off-putting to people that don't know about it. We need friends of flowers and we need friends of native landscapes. And to do that, use common names to draw them into it. They'll learn scientific names eventually if they want to learn more. So plant classification for me um, is a part of looking at plants as historical objects. And that may be an odd word to say, but historical object is something that you understand through its historical development. As an ecologist, I'm always working with landscapes, and I go all the way back and I understand geology and geologic forms and soil formation and then understand how plants inhabit that and fire history and all these sorts of things. That's how I put together a landscape in my mind. It's not just surveying the geographical position of them. I have to understand the development of the landscape to really understand it and understand why the plants are there that are there and why they're distributed as they're distributed. Plant classification is kind of the same for me. It just gives me that much deeper and more complicated perspective to put the plant in. And complicated sounds bad, but complicated is beautiful once you learn it. So yeah, to me, it's just been an important part.
Wow, so much to learn. But it was
Hold on there, bud. It's just been so much to me in enhancing my understanding of plants and my enjoyment of it, honestly.
Wow, so much to learn. But it was fun seeing how each family of plants shares so many of similar characteristics. So, I guess understanding plant families can be really useful for plant identification.
And it also helps us understand where plants come from and why they look and act the way they do.
That's pretty cool.
Indeed, bud, it was cool. I still find it cool to this day. And one of my identifying plants, running them through keys and understanding their relationships to other plants, and then looking at stuff up on the internet. It's just endless. Those are good days when I get to do that. The bad days are answering emails. So questions about plant families or anything related to it.
And we're starting to get some people typing in the chat, so definitely share any
Yeah.
questions in there. We also have the option to unmute and ask as usual. I always want to share too, I'll put it in the chat. If you're getting frustrated with finding the synonyms for what was the plant name that you knew, what has it changed to, there is something called the plants database that you can put in the species name and look at like what is that called now? Does it have any other synonyms? So sometimes when we're doing surveys and things, we have the conversion chart for a shorthand for us for the ones we're using for like a wetland mitigation survey or something like that. But if you're just trying to figure out what's the name, maybe your book is a little bit older or you have one that you really, really like, things change. It's something we all have to deal with,
And
but
yeah, change is good overall, though it's always painful, which is why most people don't like it. But the, if you're just getting to know plants, you'll probably end up with one reference. And in the Chicago area, we typically use Flora, the Chicago region. And you stay with that, and that book physically is a book. So those names aren't going to change in the book, and you continue to use that, and everyone that uses it will know the same names. The problem comes that the previous editions weren't the same. And if you look at the Army Corps of Engineers, they use a slightly different convention. And so that's when it gets confusing. But for most of you, particularly if you're starting out, find one source, stay with that, and don't worry too much. But as Jackie said, we have ways with that on our database where we can coordinate those. If you get a copy of the 50-pound flora of the Chicago region, they actually have a cross-referencing section in there, so you can find out what things were called and what they're called today.
And it is
So
12 o'clock, so if anybody has to go, you're welcome to. But I wanted to read a couple of comments that were shared in the chat. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. The uninterrupted fern always amazes me. And thank you for this great presentation. So any other questions out there? We're happy to sit on for a little bit longer. I see some typing.
I'm up. Answering questions is the best part of teaching. So you're doing me a favor if you ask questions. The harder, the better.
Can also unmute if it's easier for you, Suzanne. Oh, I think it was just a thank you. All right. I think that might be all the questions. So
Okay.
thank you all. Just a reminder, we will be posting this on our @DiscoverMCCD YouTube channel under the Tom Talks playlist, usually within a day or two. And I'll leave it to Tom for any parting words.
Well, thank you for coming today. And Tom talked on plant dispersal. Essentially, is how plants move. You didn't think they move, but plants not only move, they can move across continents and even cross oceans sometimes. So we'll learn about plant dispersal here in about a month. Hope to see you there. And until then, enjoy the weather. Not tomorrow. Stay inside.
Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Yeah. These are all the different backgrounds that could go. Okay. Well, don't do it now. Okay. Still talking. While we're here and I got on
Bye.
and leave just like say leave. Yeah, it's too just say leave is to the right.